Alison Yarrington is Professor of Art History and Dean of the School of Arts, English and Drama at Loughborough University. She specializes in the history of British sculpture of the long 19th century. In particular, sculptures display histories, the marble trade, and more broadly, British-Italian cultural transactions and the history of collections and collecting. She was academic advisor to the Chatsworth Sculpture Gallery Redisplay Project and principal investigator for the AHRC and British Academy funded online database project mapping the practice and profession of sculpture in Britain and Ireland 1851 to 1951. A collaborative project between the Institute of Art History, the University of Glasgow, and the V&A and the Henry Moore Institute. This has really been a milestone for the study of British sculpture, or sculpture in Britain. Recent publications include her edited volume Travels and Translations, Anglo-Italian Cultural Transactions, co-edited with Stefano Villani and Julia Kelly, and Bringing Modern Rome to Chatsworth, the formation of the 6th Duke of Devonshire's sculpture collection, which appeared in the 2016 volume Rome as a Transnational Sculpture Capital, 1770 to 1825. Alison is a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, a Governor of Glasgow School of Art and Chair of the British National Committee of SIHA. This afternoon, she will speak to us on Myth, Memory, and Marble, the Country House Sculpture Gallery in the Post-Napoleonic period. So please give a warm welcome to Alison Yarrington.
Thank you very much, Inga, and thanks to Ian, and to yourself, to Samantha, and of course to Malcolm for asking me to participate. I didn't need my arm twisting at all. It was a very easy transition. But it has made me think, I think like many of the speakers, about the notion of the collection in a gallery or in a museum, and how that operates, particularly in this post-Napoleonic period, and it's raised some very interesting questions for me, and I hope they might be of some mild interest to you. Immediately after Waterloo, when travel and trade, including the marble trade, between Britain and continental Europe resumed after the disruption of the wars, a distinctive phase in the collecting of sculpture and its display in country houses across Britain flowered. Over the following decade and a half, new, dedicated settings were created to house collections of contemporary sculpture or major new acquisitions of the same, which were highlighted, and I use this term very specifically and will return to it, within existing collections of antiquities and or other art forms. This seems to me to differ from the ways in which sculpture had previously been employed in country houses, in, say, the marble halls of Castle Howard or of Petworth. The creation of these early 19th century private museums of contemporary sculpture held different nuances and narratives layered according to the proclivities of the owners and distinct from, I would suggest, Samuel Johnson's mid-18th century definition of the museum as a repository of learned curiosities. And in the context of the country house, the relationship between these galleries, garden and estate, between art and nature, was significant. Sculpture in marble is, of course, a transformative outcome of geology, where the material of contemporary poetic sculpture was the same as that used by the sculptors of ancient Greece and Rome. And we might think there of the Fanti Scritti quarry in Carrara. Whilst the inclusion of other forms of marble from different localities, including those from the estates themselves, were indicative of power, possession, and wealth. A well-known example of this designation of space, which Malcolm alluded to in his keynote, which was a museum or a gallery, followed on from the 5th Duke of Bedford's relocation of his collection from town to country in 1800, that is, from Bedford House to Woburn. At Woburn, his sculpture collection was placed in Henry Holland's new greenhouse or orangery, where, with its heady mixture of art and sculpture, it prompted as John Kenworthy Brown has noted, the antiquary John Britton to describe it as an aromatic museum because of that fusion of scent and nature with the sculpture itself. From 1802 onwards, under the 6th Duke of Bedford, the sculpture collection evolved to such an extent that by 1819 it was dedicated as a sculpture gallery rather than a greenhouse. Its contents celebrated with the publication outline engravings in 1822, and that of the Three Graces accompanied by Foscolo's poem in praise of the Graces. The 6th Duke's visit to Rome in 1814 and his purchase of this group in the following year seems to have been the crucial evolutionary point in the translation from sculpture in a greenhouse to sculpture gallery. The temple, designed by Wyatt, in which the Graces were placed, an arrangement that was confirmed after Canova's visit to Woburn in 1815, included statues of the 6th Duke's daughters by Thorvaldsen and Chantry, which alluded to feminine grace and sensibility. This is an ensemble which was in place by 1818, and they're tucked away, I'm afraid, in this image. You can't see them between the main entrance and the protected space of the Graces, which of course had a door which was closed usually so that the ordinary visitor to the house would look at it through a latticed window. Two further bas reliefs on the exterior walls, which you see here by Chantry, were later commissions, and they allude again to feminine virtue, that kind of extension, as it were, from grace to the child to the mother. And these, of course, as everybody knows, face directly across the gallery to the earlier Temple of Liberty, which had been introduced by the 5th Duke and completed by his successor. And this had at its centre Nollekins' bust of Charles James Fox, and there has been a wonderful amount of literature on this particular topic, so I'm not going to go into this too much here. It's interesting, I think, to note, and it's something I want to pull out here as a point, that in 1822, the visitor to this gallery passed through an anteroom before arriving at the Temple of the Graces, which was decorated with prints after Canova's works, commemorative of the sculptor who had died that year, and indicative of his significance in this place, and as the widely acknowledged Prince of Sculptors in Rome. As the sculpture gallery at Woburn was nearing completion, I think it's interesting to note that in Stockholm, the Royal Stone Museum, housing the ancient statue of Endymion, was also in process of redisplay. Here there was a similar connectivity between the ancient world and its reinvention in the present, indicated by a display of prints, again in an anteroom, after works by the leading national Swedish sculptor Johan Sergel, who had died in 1814. And if I had time, I would talk about Sergel's contribution to the orangery belonging to the royal family, where there are wonderful sculptures by him holding torches, lighting up the space. And I thought this is a kind of useful, not intermission, interval, as it were, between Woburn and between Chatsworth, which I want to focus my attention on for most of this paper. Canova considered the English to be amongst his most enlightened patrons. Whether he really believed that or not is another matter, but he certainly said it. This afternoon I want to focus upon one of the most generous and enlightened patrons of contemporary sculpture, William Spencer Cavendish, the 6th Duke of Devonshire. The 6th Duke made his first visit to Rome in 1819, when he was beginning to formalise his plans for a sculpture gallery at Chatsworth, which he was in the early stages of building, or rather building an extension. It seems an understatement, really, for the scale of magnificence of the new north wing, which we can see, I hope, if that's working. Well, anyway, you can see it as you're looking at it to the left, that long extension which you see sticking out from the main body of the house. And I think it's important to realise that that was a suite of rooms of which the sculpture gallery was part, so that very briefly you go up the oak stairs, you go into an extended library because the Duke was a great bibliophile, you then go into an anteroom, you go into the state dining room, another anteroom which has a musician's gallery and the stairs up from the kitchen so you can bring the food up and down. And then you enter the sculpture gallery. Then if you get a bit hot and bothered, you go out into the garden, or you go into a plunge pool, which is down in the bottom, and then you can go up to play charades up in the theatre above. And if it all gets too much, you go up into the belvedere at the top. So this is a grand concept which is a wonderful, a new way of thinking about display and about ownership and collection. After Canova's death, the formation of the gallery changed and in many ways became a hymn of praise to the sculptor with a memorial to him, not as a kind of prelude to the visit to the gallery, but actually bang slap in the middle of it. And it was a memorial to him and, of course, the Six Dukes' enlightened patronage, which was integral to this space. And it was also, as I will go on to explain, very much about the Duke's circle in Rome. And you can see that wall, if you look in this slide here, the Schwanthaler perhaps ignore for the moment because a later edition commissioned in 1846. But on the back wall, you can see up on the wall the bust of Canova and the bust of the Duke, Hebe raising her cup to the Duke on the right-hand side, and the copy after the Canova lions from the papal tomb of Clement XIII to either side of the door. So there we have it, Canova at the centre of the gallery. But I'm going to talk about another kind of iteration of that. The distinctive ways in which sculpture was displayed in British country houses occurs at the time when owners such as the 6th Duke of Bedford and Devonshire were able once more to engage directly with Rome, a place that in their early years had been an entrancing dream, became a lived reality. However, Napoleon's disaggregation and seizure of collections in continental Europe and the subsequent restitution and sale of works of art from the French state and the Bonaparte family collections following the defeats of 1814 and 15 indicates the complexities of the market in which collectors, dealers and sculptors operated in these immediate post-war years. And of course, Christopher Johns and Kate Eustace have both looked at this troubled and broken political landscape in relation to Canova's central role in the politics of art and restitution. And they chart very effectively the unsettled and dangerous circumstances which were negotiated by the sculptor and by Cardinal Consalvi in ensuring the return to Rome of sculpture from the papal collections. Across Europe, the restitution of works taken from major private collections was also underway, and sculpture as a possession, as property, was high on the cultural agenda. Alongside the movement of canonical works of antiquity from Paris to Rome and the building of a state-of-the-art gallery in the Vatican, the Braccio Nuovo, that opened in 1822, there was also the debate in around sculptural and cultural value that surrounded the acquisition of the Elgin marbles, taken from the Parthenon that had arrived in England in 1806. These, of course, were eventually purchased again in 1816 by the government, persuaded by the testimony of leading figures in the art world, including Canova, on their quality and their importance. There was, therefore, a heightened sense of the complexity inherent in ancient and contemporary marbles. On the one hand, there was the permanence and significance of ancient works that had outlived time, and at the same time, there was sculpture's innate fragility and vulnerability, which was particularly prescient, I think, in these collections of ancient and modern works. Perhaps we should think, which is clearly an obvious example, but of Shelley's poem Ozymandias, published in 1818, after the British Museum acquired the fragment of a statue of Pharaoh Ramesses II, Ozymandias being the Greek name for Ramesses. And on the pedestal these words appear, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my work, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." And it's that sense of the transience of power which I believe is very much centred in the display at Chatsworth, come on to in a moment. The creation of private sculpture galleries or museums was, of course, a European-wide phenomenon. a collecting trope conducted by an international, cosmopolitan, aristocratic elite which crossed national boundaries. Inga Schemper-Sparholtz's investigations into Prince Esterhazy's now dispersed collection of contemporary sculpture in the Marienhilf in Vienna, or outside Vienna, makes this point, looking outwards to others such as Sommerriva's Villa Carlotta on Lake Como, or Prince Torlonia's Roman palace, and including, of course, her study of Metternich's villa on the Rennweg in the context of Bartolini's sculpture. The description of the Esterhazy collection by Josef von Hohlmeier of 1823, I think, is useful to us here. I quote, "We could really call this salon a sanctuary of marvellous art treasures which come together to bewitch the eye. In the middle of the room are the marvellous marble groups placed side by side, which are amongst the noblest and best things in recent art. The favourable top lighting falls like magic onto the charming figures." So the idea of a sanctuary where works come together that bewitches the eye seems to me to be central to any interpretation of these post-war spaces. The Esterhazy collection included works by Canova, Thorvaldsen, Bartolini and others, and included Shadow's, Spinner and Tenerani's Cupid removing a thorn from Venus's foot, works which also appear in versions or copies in the Chatsworth collection. The sculpture gallery in Metternich's villa, of course, which you can see up on the top left-hand side of the screen, had very much at its centre a much prized copy of Canova's Cupid and Psyche that arrived from the sculptor's studio in 1820. It's sometimes designated as a copy by Tenerani. With a central porphyry tazza, a gift from the Emperor of Russia, the museum is in many ways in similar arrangement to that at Chatsworth, with stone walls and top lighting. However, the use of the mirror, which you can see behind the Cupid and Psyche, which of course echoes the arrangement of the Penitent Magdalene in its exhibition in Paris, in Sommerriva's house there, is different. We don't have mirrors at Chatsworth, they were never put in place. But this is a different kind of viewing, and I think it shows the importance of being able to view simultaneously both the back and the front of the work. And I think back to the paper we just saw about Girardon's presentation of his collection. And I wanted to notice, I've outlined in yellow the words from Metternich's private letters, where he talks about his garden house, about a museum, and about the importance of what the sculpture was for him, something that never answered back, always useful. In 1817, the 6th Duke had made his first extensive continental tour of France, the German states, the Nordic countries, and Russia, where he saw the aftermath of war on great houses and collections, perhaps none more significant for him than Yusupov's palace just outside Moscow. Purchased in 1810 by the prince, it housed his extensive sculpture collection. In 1812, of course, it was overrun by the French, and 2 of his most prized works by Canova were saved from the invaders by the quick thinking of the servants. And it's a story recorded in the Duke's Thought Book of 1817, which I've put up on the screen for you to read. Yusupov and the 6th Duke had an enormous amount in common, both in terms of their role, their interest in the theatre, their role within the state, their role as advisor, and their interest in the arts. But it seems to, again, be that encounter with Yusupov's collection and the sense of sculpture under threat at this time that really triggers the Duke's imagination. It's the theatre of it, the drama of it. And it awakens, it seems, his passion for marble, which will then go on in his shopping trips that take place from 1819 onwards. The Duke also visited Stockholm and visited the Royal Palace, and mentions about the way in which the gallery was under redisplay at that time. And he went to Russia, where he was often in the company of Crown Prince Nicholas, who, of course, comes back to Chatsworth to visit. He left St. Petersburg in July, visiting Kassel and Vienna en route to Venice and Padua. I don't have time to talk about Kassel, but I wanted to, because I'm not going to be talking about the gardens, but I wanted to link with the papers this morning, that Kassel hugely impressed the 6th Duke, as you can see from the text on the right. And of course, I think one of the reasons why the sculptor Chantry, who was very close to the Duke, the British sculptor Francis Chantry, was so excited at the prospect of doing a colossal work in local rock, comes, I think, from this idea of castle, and of course the Hercules and the broken cascade and the Emperor Fountain that arrives at Chatsworth really does echo in many ways this kind of development. And again, this is recorded in the thought book with the watercolours that you see there. I want to return, because I have very little time, to the sculpture gallery itself, and I'm showing you the opposite side of the sculpture gallery to the one you saw in the opening slide. And you'll remember from Malcolm's talk yesterday, you saw it in its kind of post-2002 state, just before it got emptied out for the filming of Pride and Prejudice, when all those green and red hangings went, and suddenly people realised what a wonderful space it was and how the light was amazing and the sculpture looked so different. In 1818, during a visit to Paris, the 6th Duke makes his first major purchase of contemporary work, one of the most important purchases, and that is of Madame Mère by Canova, which you saw in the first slide, and I'll return to in a moment. The starting point, really, of his collection of very high-quality contemporary works. The following year, he commissions the Venus from Thorvaldsen, which you see here on the slide, and the Endymion from Canova, the prize of his collection, a subject chosen by the sculptor and which was replicated in a cast by Chantry in the garden in the early 1830s. In 1819, he acquired the Hebe from Lord Cawdor, you see on the far left of the slide, and that arrived in Chatsworth in 1822, and the head of Petrarch's Laura of 1818 was obtained through the intervention of the Duchess Elizabeth, his stepmother resident in Rome. Immediately after Canova's death, he also acquired the portrait bust of Madame Mère that he considered particularly fine. There we have the slide again. And we see at the centre the head of Napoleon, which came through his friend, the Canovite, the Marchioness of Abercorn, Aqua Infelice, as he called her, because of her habit of crying, and who had actually bought it from Sartori. It's supposedly the last portrait. It is the last portrait of the Emperor by Canova, and it's positioned between the marble forms of Paolina and Madame Mère in Pride of Place, a family group in the central west bay of the gallery, opposite to the only antique work in that gallery, the Head of Alexander, and across the enormous Tatzer of Mecklenburg granite, which the Duke particularly prized, which stands at the centre. But it was Canova's death, followed by other members of the 6th Duke family in close circle in Rome, which in 1819 had seemed set fair for the realisation of his plans for the gallery, that saw a major increase in the pace of purchase of the works and a change in their final arrangement. Napoleon, of course, died in 1821. Consalvi and the Duke's stepmother, the Duchess Elizabeth, died in 1824, and he had to bring her body back from Rome to England. And his close friend, Paolina Borghese, died in 1825. And the earlier acquisition of Canova's statue of Madame Mère, who dies in 1836, just after the gallery is completed, therefore takes on a pivotal role in this display. I want just briefly to show you the evolution of the gallery from its early beginnings to its completion in 1835. The evidence for this is found in the Duke's diaries. You see pages of that on the left with the pressed flowers that he collected, and his correspondence. And this notes his interactions with other collectors such as Giovanni Torlonia, the Duce of Bracciano, and Somariva. The final arrangement of his collection, which seems to have been overseen personally by the Duke, you can see an intermediary state of play on the right where he's putting in these works, and from that you can just see the scale of purchase which is going on. It was like everybody's Christmases come together. The Chatsworth carpenters made cutouts of the sculpture which were wheeled around the room for the Duke so that he could see where they were to be placed in the autumn of 1834, and then he left to allow the works to be put in place whilst he took one of his long tours. The Sixth Duke's circle in Rome, as I've said, was crucial for his collecting project. An extract from Lady Morgan's Italy, published in 1821, shows the British engagement with key figures there, including Torlonia, described by Lady Morgan as the only Roman collector of contemporary works, whose own palace in the Piazza Venezia housed an extensive sculpture collection, again with Canova's Hercules and Lycus, as you can just see on the frontispiece for one of these volumes, 3 volumes of his collection, which was published in 1842, which was a major focal point of the collection. The statue itself arrived it was in place by 1815, and on the top right you see a family portrait of the Torlonia family by Toffanelli from 1812, around 1812. But I think what I want you to note here is at the end of this extract on the right, it's about the different circles that come together, but it's also about Paolina Borghese and about Madame Mère and about the Cardinal Consalvi too, and about how that family worked. And I think in the context of the arrangement at Chatsworth, the description of Madame Mère's sole object of her thoughts and feelings, the prisoner of Saint Helena, is key to the arrangement of her statue in that place. And we have to remember the inscription on that statue, which was suggested by Lord Holland in Greek, the unfortunate mother of the greatest of men. All collections are to some degree a form of autobiography for private reflection and public presentation, and this is as true at Chatsworth as anywhere else. I want quickly just to show a montage. I apologise about the post-it notes, but some of these photographs were taken when the rearrangement was going on, to show you the interchange, the dialogues that are going on here, which refer to Napoleon and Napoleon's exile. The Tazza by Bartolini is a copy of one of those which was on Elba in the house which Paolina went to stay with Napoleon in during his exile. The portrait of her, which is the counterpart to the Madame Mère of Paolina by Campbell, shows Paolina looking at a portrait medallion of Napoleon, and perhaps comparing how poor it is by comparison with the Canova. I always think you can see Madame Mère on the other side, and in the base of the pedestals, and the pedestals in Chatsworth are hugely important, are the medals of iron from Elba, which were which were something that were given to Paolina and which she gave to the Duke as a present. And on the other side, the Torvalds and Venus, which arrived broken from Italy and was mended. The wrist originally had the mourning bracelet on it that Paolina wore. That, again, was a present to the Duke. So this, then, we have a theatre of display where there is myth and memory of Napoleon and his family, with Rome at its centre, conjured by the marble forms created by Canova and his contemporaries, surrounded by rare marble artefacts and articulated by dramatic lighting effects, which come from the top lighting that you can see there. And I just thought I'd show you, this isn't Photoshop. This is something that Charles Noble, the curator I worked with most closely on this project, caught, because we suddenly realized that as the sun moved around the house, it spotlighted through the lanterns, through the plate lanterns, the figures which were in the gallery as we put them back in their original places. And of course, the Sixth Duke had bought glass, having much admired it during his ambassadorial visit to Russia in 1826 to the wedding of his friend Nicholas. And that is, again, another story. The use of plate glass in Chatsworth is a very important part of that. And I wanted to show you this quickly because it happens elsewhere. It happens in the Thorvaldsen Museum, but we also caught it happening in Liverpool when we were installing the statue of Kitty Wilkinson there. Dramatic effects in St George's Hall, again about 6 o'clock in the evening, when suddenly these niches were lit up. And of course that happens with Endymion, and I'm so looking forward to Elise Nelson's work on Endymion. She's doing some fantastic work on Canova, and the work of the Summer of Love. I think she gave a wonderful paper at Ghent quite recently that I heard. So this is kind of expanding this field, I think, of thinking. But of course, the high polish on the Canova here suggests the moon's rays that would shine down from Diana on him. And I have this theory that by moonlight, the moonlight, if it's in full, kind of in its full position above the house in a clear sky, would also spotlight Endymion. But I haven't persuaded Charles to go down there in a sleeping bag yet to find out if that's actually the case. The lighting in the gallery, as you can see, there are two candelabra bought from the Wanstead sale, again, and other purchases made in 1822. And I think that this idea, of course, of looking at the work looked at by taper, by torchlight, by artificial light, is actually central to an understanding of the gallery itself and the Duke's love of theatre. The Medici vase, the copy by Bartolini, again completed in 1822, which now stands in the centre of the shop, but did stand in the centre of the orangery, used to have lamps placed inside it during great festivities, parties that the Duke did, to give that sense of almost kinetic life to the relief on the outside. And we found, or rather Charles and Matthew found, an internal metal kind of tube which seems to have gone inside, which allowed the light to be properly focused. All this stood amongst aromatic foliage and flowers, and Chinese scent jars were also in the orangery, which is on the other side of the gallery, linked to the gallery. And as the Duke commented, of a night it holds powerful lamps that send up such a magical light on the branches of the Altingia that people cry out, "Fairyland." Whilst Chatsworth was the stage for carefully choreographed grand displays to entertain and surprise the six Duke's many guests, it was at the same time for him a place of personal, intellectual pleasure and also intense artistic pleasure. Nowhere was this more clearly articulated, I think, than in the gallery and the orangery. The latter produced, of course, when Paxton comes to Chatsworth, and the Duke asked Wyatville to adapt his designs to accommodate that love of botany, horticulture, and sculpture, and, of course, geology. And, of course, he purchases from the Malmaison sale orange trees, and he writes about the scent of those orange trees pervading the house on a seasonal basis. I want to finish by looking at and of course this system of lighting up Chatsworth continues today. I just put that down on the bottom to show that it's a tradition that still continues. So I want and that's the gallery, just to finish with the relationship between a sculpture gallery and an estate, perhaps nowhere more pronounced than in the collection of contemporary British sculpture formed by the Third Earl of Egremont at Petworth. This is what I think is best described as a kind of Brexit collection, focused almost entirely upon British sculpture and setting itself against the tide of international influence at Woburn and Chatsworth. In 1794, the Third Earl moved his art collection from London to his country house, Petworth, and began to add major commissions from British sculptors, Flaxman, Carew, who of course became sculptor in residence there pretty much, Westmacott and Rossi. And we have Flaxman's Pastoral Apollo, commissioned in 1814, and St. Michael overcoming Satan, commissioned in 1817, finished in 1826. And of course you can see J.M.W. Turner's evocations of that space on the right. So this very nationalistic kind of promotion, as it were, to put it kindly, of British sculpture was both around the choice of sculptures, but also the subjects. They were taken from epic and Georgian poetry, from obviously the beginnings of Virgil's Georgics, but notably there were subjects from Milton's Paradise Lost of 1667 and Thomson's Seasons, which were published together in a total volume in 1730. And Petworth today, the one at the bottom says it's seen at night. I don't think it is. It's seen by daylight because you can't see anybody holding tapers. I think it's a mislabeling. This is Petworth today, and I just put up there for your consideration the marble hall on the top left-hand corner, so you can get a sense of how different this kind of interaction was. And this kind of display, of course, has moved on and changed over time. The gallery at Petworth was extended between 1824 and 27, top-lit, the walls were white, as you saw in the previous slides, to house a collection that was not static. As Creevey noticed in 1828, the earliest perpetually changing the positions of their places, and this same ebb and flow of collection at Chatsworth is noticed by the guides during the Sixth Duke's lifetime, when he brings more in and moves more out. We stopped the display pretty much at the end of the Duke's life. And this ebb and flow, this changing interaction, continues to this day. And I'll leave you with that, which is the intervention, as you can see, by Michael Craig Martin, who saw these objects as sculpture, not as having this kind of historic, as you can see from what he says about them on the left, not as a historic space, but a space where he sets the sculptures free by producing these kind of Revlon pink bases and covering up those wonderful geological specimens put in the basis of the sculpture. So I leave you with that. I thought it would perhaps lead us on to thinking about James's discussion later on. Thank you very much.